Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Good.
So my presentation is titled Putting It All Together, Informatics Challenges and Opportunities in Health Outcomes Research. The title is a little bit different from before because I really liked the idea of trying to put everything I've learned into one presentation. So I've studied a lot about clinical research informatics, and I've learned a lot in my internship about health outcomes research, and I'm really interested in the intersection of those two topics. So it was a challenge actually to put this presentation together, and hopefully it makes sense. So to start with the key things I learned up front, clinical research can be very inefficient, and I've sort of categorized this into four main categories. I'm sure there's more, but the main ones that I identified were scientific issues, technical issues, policy issues, and governance issues. So one of the things that gets floated around a lot in research is that it takes about 17 years for research evidence to reach clinical practice. And this probably has to do with the process of designing a study, getting funding for the study, finding patients for the study, recruiting and consenting patients for the study, designing systems to collect the data, including paper forms. And then on top of all of that, you have to make sure you're compliant with HIPAA, conflicts of interest, IRB, animal subjects, if that's applicable, many policies. So collecting data is a very, very slow going process. Another main point that I learned is that, and this came a little bit from some of my previous work experience, that it can be really complicated to develop solutions from your clinical research findings that can then be implemented into clinical practice. So one of the things I noticed in my previous position in tech transfer is that there would be a lot of people coming to me with app ideas, and it's pretty simple, I suppose, to develop an application, a mobile health application, but to actually get that to integrate into the EHR and to be used in practice and to be integrated with clinical workflows is a whole other problem. And I can't seem to maneuver through my notes, but I had a statistic that there were 3,000 new mobile health applications every year. And I just want to ask the audience how many they think of those mobile applications every year are actually used. Probably a very small percentage, if I had to guess. And then my third major finding is that, in my opinion, I think clinical research informatics tools and approaches are the key to boosting a lot of aspects of research efficiency and improving the ability to move innovations into the clinic and the ability to implement findings into clinical practice. There are other approaches that also would help expedite research, but my focus in this presentation is on how informatics tools can help. And my last finding was that specific to this practicum, I think health outcomes research can benefit substantially from clinical research informatics tools and approaches. So I mentioned a little bit before, I have a background that has spanned a lot of different sides of research. So I started out in research compliance and ethics. I worked for the HIPAA privacy officer at Boston University, and we did a lot of conflict of interest reviews, and I learned all about HIPAA and IRB issues and human ethics issues. Then I moved on to technology transfer, where I learned that it is very hard to get new devices and drugs into the clinic, and very expensive. And then in my next position, I worked for innovation support, providing grants to innovative research projects. And I realized that a lot of the funding would support high-risk innovative research projects, but getting their outcomes into practice was still very complicated and would have taken years beyond the initial project to effect. And in my practicum and as part of my work in the patient-reported outcomes core, I've been focusing on learning the ins and outs of research project management, data collection and management, and the general points of outcomes research. So it's been a great experience, and I think it's it's made me very well-rounded in the world of research. Okay, so the goals of my internship were within the patient-reported outcomes core I really wanted to understand a better and more comprehensive view of what clinical research informatics is. It's the certificate program only gives you 5 courses. Most of those courses out of personal interest were for me just database related topics. So I really began the internship without a foundation for what does clinical research informatics mean. I knew it had 2 terms in it that I liked, clinical research and informatics, but I didn't know how they went together. And then I wanted to identify some common challenges for informatics and opportunities, and I wanted to specify that within the framework of health outcomes research. And then as I went along, I realized that in the course of doing work at the Procore, I had started digging into a lot of data collection and data management issues that kept coming up repeatedly. And started developing a best practices document or guideline for collecting data and managing data in health outcomes research specifically. And so that's ended up being my deliverable for the practicum, is this best practices document that I hope to finalize in a very nice format and then distribute to our health outcomes researchers. It's especially targeted towards newer health outcomes researchers and students who I've noticed when you start at UNC, there's really no single place to get information at UNC about how to do all of the things related to data collection and data management. So I'm hoping that that will be very useful. And the last goal of my internship, which has not been accomplished yet, was I wanted to develop some best practices for API integration. This required a little bit more technical knowledge than I have yet, but it's coming. So I'm hoping that in the next few months, I will have figured out enough about APIs and webhooks and all sorts of things to be able to do this. So how am I doing? So I wanted to start with the NIH definition of clinical research. So I found this really interesting. Clinical research is not just clinical trials, although that tends to be what people think of first. Clinical research is anything that's patient-oriented. So a lot of the clinical trials are captured under bullet point number 1, but it also includes epidemiological and behavior studies. A lot of that uses secondary data analysis. And then number 3 is the one I'm focused on, which is health outcomes research and health services research. So clinical research informatics is a concept that focuses on developing theories, tools, and solutions to accelerate the translation of research findings from basic science to clinical science and then to implementation. In a way, I see this as very parallel to the field of technology transfer, which is accelerating bench to bedside research. So I just think that clinical research informatics is very interesting because it uses technology to approach some of the inefficiencies in research. And it recognizes that one of the most important components of making research more efficient is related to data collection and data management. There are many others, but that is one of the most important. So this is just a definition for anyone who isn't aware that health outcomes research seeks to identify and improve the end results of the healthcare delivery system. And this includes its impact on the well-being of patients and populations. And I know that you guys are very familiar with that. So the next slide I added recently. This slide is more for Javed. So I know that in our certificate, we've talked a lot about the value-based care model and the transition of the US healthcare system to a value-based care system. And I liked this image that I pulled off the internet because it shows that you cannot move to a value-based care system without outcomes. You can focus on managing costs and you can focus on improving quality, but you need the outcomes in order to improve value. And outcomes are very hard to measure. It is not something that you just find in the EHR. So to continue on that point, outcomes research takes data from many sources. So unlike basic science research, where a lot of data is going to be in the lab, it's going to be in laboratory notebooks, or on the flip side, clinical trial studies, which have very well-defined electronic data capture systems, outcomes research is in a fuzzy middle ground where you're collecting data from all different sources. So you might have claims data, you might have EHR data, you're getting data directly from patients, you might be capturing data from people other than the patients, like their caregivers. You might be capturing data about the clinical sites themselves or the staff members at those sites. You might be collecting data, increasingly so, from health apps or devices, things like Fitbits and Garmin's, and yeah, lots of apps. And then there are a lot of research data repositories that you might be trying to sync data from. So the Carolina Data Warehouse is one example. I know of a study that we're working on that will be taking some data from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. So there are many different sources of data. And then finally, the data that does not get talked about enough in research is that when you have an electronic data collection system, you might also be able to capture metadata. So that's data about the data. It's data about the time stamps and dates and IP addresses that people are taking their surveys, for example, or the geographic location of the person who clicked on the link, things like that. The amount of time it took them to take the survey. I think this is frequently overlooked. So just to keep going on why outcomes research is unique and uniquely complicated, the data collection modes are also very varied. What I've learned in my practicum is that data is not just collected through a single mechanism. In fact, it's usually collected via a bunch of different places, different mechanisms. So in many of our studies, we collect data from paper, we collect it from web-based forms, we also collect it from IVR, interactive voice response calls. We collect it through electronic data management systems that sync into other systems and pull data. And then for some of our device studies, we pull device data through API integrations. So there's lots of data sources and there's lots of data modes, data capture modes. So hopefully this is showing how health outcomes research is very complicated and needs clinical research informatics tools. Another reason that outcomes research is particularly complicated is that it involves an immense amount of integration with the clinical workflow. We do get requests for a lot of studies to integrate EHR, to integrate outcomes research data with the EHR, and vice versa. We get requests for studies where EHR data, the scientist wishes to pull EHR data into the research data collection system. To date, I don't know of any studies where we've had data going in both directions or been asked for data to go in both directions, but I imagine that would be really complicated. In addition, so the outcomes research is highly integrated into the clinical workflow. So you have patients are being recruited right from the clinic during clinical visits. So it's more complicated than basic research because in basic research, you're just in a laboratory working on mice. In outcomes research, you are in the clinic as a researcher trying to get patients and consent them while they're going to doctor's visits and getting chemo. It's a busy setup. It's very easy to find that the doctor doesn't have time for you to be in the room right now. All of these things complicate data collection. Other aspects of workflow integration are we've had projects where the PI wants to generate symptom alerts that go to clinical staff. So when particular outcomes are determined from the data collection, for example, if the pain threshold for a patient reaches a certain level, the study wants an alert that goes to the nurse to notify the nurse that this patient is receiving a high level of pain this week. What do you want to do about that? We've also had studies where clinicians want feedback or reports at the end of every week. They want to see how is my patient doing. How have their symptoms changed over time? Things like that. So there's a lot of integration issues specific to outcomes research. Another thing that makes outcomes research very complicated is its integration with devices. And I also think this is why it's very exciting. I think outcomes research, unlike a lot of other kinds of research, has the potential to involve lots of device and application integrations. It just seems like there's so much potential to have APIs with things all over the place to collect data from all sorts of new data sets. I look at Antonio because I'm not sure how many of these data sources are valid and reliable. And that's a question, that's a science question, is yes, you can get data from pretty much anything now. Can you use it in research? That's a question I would love to see answered someday. We have looked at studies that show that there is reliability in things like Garmin fitness trackers. I think we found that the Apple Watch is not reliable as a data source. But there's a lot of research questions that need to be answered related to using devices in outcomes research. And I am particularly interested in the Amazon Alexa. I know that that has been talked about a lot in the clinical research informatics world. When I've gone to hackathons, the Alexa is pretty much the top thing talked about for, what if Alexa can tell patients when to take their medications? And what if we can have Alexa ask them, did you take your medication? Did you walk today? Did you have pain today? And Alexa was recently approved for HIPAA compliant data transfer. So I think that's a big deal. And finally, to keep talking about why outcomes research is complex, there are also a lot of data collection schedule variations and frequency variations. So we have surveys collected at different time points, and we have different surveys that are collected for different people at different time points. So one of the, just a pitch for Procore is that I've noticed other data collection systems are great for consistent survey data collection, but when you deal with complicated clinical schedules and clinical workflows, it's important to have a data collection system that you can customize in the way that Procore is able to do. Similarly, there are study arms and randomization where different patients go on to different interventions. Thinking specifically of the COMET study, and that leads to a lot of complication because different patients on different arms receive different surveys and they may have different outcomes, and how you collect that data and manage that data is very different depending on which arm the patient is on. Device management is something that we noticed can be very difficult with outcomes research, specifically syncing issues. We've had devices randomly stop collecting data and we haven't been able to figure out why. If there's not good Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connections in a hospital environment, it doesn't necessarily sync properly. We've had issues with the wrong accounts syncing to the wrong devices. So it's fraught with issues and there's room for a lot of improvement. And finally, outcomes research involves very large research teams, or can involve very large research teams, and can involve multi-site studies, which just adds to the complication when you're dealing with 80 different sites and site staff at every different site, and each site may have its own impression of how to follow the protocol. It's very common for questions to arise related to what happens if this happens, and there's no amount of planning at the beginning of research to figure out what all of those questions are going to be. So being flexible during the research process is incredibly important. So I took a look at different kinds of clinical research informatics tools and methods, and I thought that there were just many, many opportunities for it to benefit outcomes research. So, and I don't know a lot about all of these different things. Probably most of my focus has been on the data management systems part, but there are tools for recruitment. Things like I2B2 are incredibly helpful for deciding whether you have enough patients, whether your study is feasible at a given location. There are retention and adherence tools, which I don't know too much about. Electronic data capture gets its own section because that is the official term of things like metadata rave and open clinica, and there's hundreds of systems, but they're all specific to clinical trials. There really aren't a lot of electronic data management systems that are commercially available for non-clinical trial research. There is Encore and CRMS at UNC. Both of them are pretty terrible. Having used both of them, I find that there's a lot of room for improvement. They make it very difficult to figure out which tab to select and how to update it. They do link to other UNC systems fairly well, like the IRB and EPIC, but there's a lot of room for improvement in that. So consequently, most researchers who are not required to use these systems, for example, if you're not doing a cancer study, you don't necessarily need to use an electronic data management system at UNC. They're pretty much using network drives, spreadsheets, cloud storage solutions, and that may be fine, but it just means that there's data and policies all over the place, and it can be easy to lose track of them, and it might be better organized a different way. So other things that clinical research informatics tools can do are they can monitor the data quality, and they can help you track how complete the data is. So we have a study where the tools that Procore has designed have allowed the clinical research assistant to be able to see which surveys have not been completed and which sites to go after for data. So it just helps you track where you're at in your study a little bit better than just having lots and lots of spreadsheets. Other things, allowing for secure and compliant data sharing across sites, and being able to integrate across different data sources. So Procore does allow you to pull in data from things like Garmin or Fitbit, things like that. Integration is a really big point of clinical research informatics. So some of the technological challenges. So to start with the different challenges, because I identified technological, scientific, policy, and governance related challenges. So for technological challenges, systems integration seems to be the big one. I had the opportunity to work with Metadata Rave and Procore, and to see some of the issues that came about by trying to get data from Metadata Rave into Procore. And for the most part, it had to do with statuses. Statuses on one system were different than statuses on the other. And the rules for when certain statuses were pushed from one system to another changed, or were unclear. They weren't clearly defined at the very beginning of the study, which led to a lot of confusion midway through the study. Another thing that happened quite often is that in the middle of the study, the team wants to make changes to their data collection instrument, and that can lead to issues with the data collection itself, inconsistencies in the data, things like that. And then one big one that we noticed, at least with Procore, is that there are issues where when you have multi-site studies and non-centralized IRBs, there can sometimes be issues where each site has requirements that can't go live until it gets IRB approval. So in one particular study, we had Spanish language that was not approved to go out, and it, or certain features were not approved to go out until that site approved it in its IRB, and holding off on going live with certain features. It gets really complicated when you're a systems person trying to figure out what you can and cannot do. So that's actually an integration of technology and policy issues. Other challenges I've noticed, there are spam filtering issues. So we do IVR phone calls, and we've had a few text messaging interventions to collect outcomes data from patients. But what we found is that with the increase in spam robocalling, there have also been a lot of algorithms designed by the major phone companies, which is great, to filter out spam calls. But the problem is that with that is that they're filtering out UNC calls. And so we've had to figure out if there are ways that we can make calls that don't get designated as spam. I think we're still trying to figure out how to navigate that issue, but it is a problem. I mentioned before device issues with syncing problems. internet connectivity. We had a study that wanted to collect outcomes data in Malawi, but one of the biggest issues is that there was spotty internet connection throughout the hospital. So having a tablet and collecting data on the tablet sounds great in theory, but in practice, without great internet connectivity, you can't actually get the data consistently. And then finally, there are development costs. There's a certain amount of time that needs to be allocated to designing a research data collection system before you launch the study. And you have to be aware of user access to your system, and this also relates to compliance, making sure that the right people and only the people who need to know and have access to PHI are the ones that access your system, and that when they leave, you are keeping track of that and removing them from the system. So scientific challenges, so these are things like using multiple data collection modes and methods. So we've had experiences where if there are different kinds of data collection modes, there can be some inconsistencies where staff aren't sure how the SOP changes depending on which mode you're using. So if you're using paper, what do you do when you're done with the paper form versus if you're using a tablet versus if you're sending them a link or they're completing it in clinic. These are things that really have to be thought about, unfortunately, at the very beginning of the study, but often aren't easy to identify until you're already doing the work. Sometimes there's misleading or confusingly worded survey questions. And then there are things like sampling bias and response bias. Just briefly, an example of sampling bias would be studies that are designed around iPhone apps. I was talking to somebody about how great it would be to use Apple Research Kit for data collection, but that necessitates using Apple products. Apple products are very expensive. Very expensive products are more likely to only be owned by people of a certain socio-demographic type, and you're getting bias in the type of people that you're recruiting. Other things I've noticed are when you enroll patients at specific major academic medical centers, you're tending to get people from academic cities and towns. They tend to be highly educated, which is not a surprise. But if you're looking to enroll patients who are high school diploma or less, you actually probably need to branch out into clinics that are not just in major academic medical center areas. So there's a lot of scientific challenges, and I don't think I'll talk about all of them here. And a lot of these cannot necessarily be fixed with clinical research informatics tools. It just depends. So policy challenges was the thing in my practicum that I ended up spending a lot of time on, maybe unintentionally. So I noticed that the biggest one for me was HIPAA. So just trying to transfer data from one place to another became incredibly complicated. What I learned was that fax machines at UNC are not standard fax machines, that nearly all of the fax machines at UNC are using an IP connection, and that is not HIPAA approved or HIPAA compliant. So it means that you cannot share PHI, like medical records, using fax machines. I don't know how much this is understood by researchers across the campus, but I know that a lot of researchers think, I just need to get PHI from this place to this place. I'll just fax it. Fax is universally considered to be a good method for data transfer, but it isn't at UNC. So figuring out what allowable methods are to transfer PHI from one place to another is very important. What we ended up finding was that the best solution in this case is either using your network drives, which are approved for PHI, or we learned that Microsoft SharePoint Teams does allow storage of PHI. I also ran into issues where we were looking at policies related to data retention and data destruction, and I could not find any clear policies at UNC about this. There is a clear guideline from the federal government that you're required to retain research records for at least 6 years, and there is a clear requirement from HIPAA that says that you need to retain HIPAA-related research documents like your authorization form for 6 years. But there's not anything at UNC that says how many years they want you to keep your data. And data destruction policies are just as complicated. So it's a lot of, we recommend that you keep your data this long, but they don't tell you when do you destroy it, how do you destroy it. There is a lot of assumptions that the data you're destroying is on paper only. When you delete data, that's not, how many times do you have to delete it? Do you need to wipe your disk 3, 4, 5 times? What is an appropriate amount of deletion for data destruction? Similarly, with information security, we ran into some gaps in knowing what the best practices were for research data collection. Just trying to figure out, can I use my personal laptop to collect HIPAA research data? Was not an easy process, and I still don't really know the answer to that. I ended up deciding that it was not worth it because potential loss of a laptop with HIPAA data on it generates such a huge compliance issue that I would not be willing to take that risk on. But there's no easy document at UNC that says, warning, if you choose to use your personal laptop to store PHI, this is what you're responsible for in the event it's lost. It's not clear, and I think it should be. Other things, I noticed there wasn't a lot of guidance on just how to collect data or how to store it or how to manage it. So I was just looking everywhere at UNC for, I'm a new researcher. How do I collect data? Where do I put it? How do I manage it? It's nowhere to be found. So these were things that I thought needed improvement, and that is sort of the foundation for the guide that I developed as a deliverable. So governance challenges, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to mention that implementing solutions is very dependent on institutional governance. The institution itself does a risk-benefit analysis, and they have strategic priorities, and if you want to implement a health outcome solution in EPIC, for example, it has to meet what the institution wants and the priorities of the institution. It's also most likely that the institution is looking for scientific validation and feasibility to be demonstrated before any solutions are proposed to be implemented in EPIC particularly. The other thing that I've noticed is that solutions that are implemented tend to be sort of limited in scope. So you might see forms that are collecting outcomes data in EPIC, but only for a given department or a given clinician, or a specific disease, or just very project specific. So I haven't seen examples of outcome solutions that affect the entire EPIC system, and I'm not sure where you would start if you wanted to start doing that. So this is my attempt to just show that the forest for the trees metaphor, that I spent a lot of time chasing down details on individual trees and getting myself overwhelmed because there is so much in health outcomes research and in clinical research informatics to keep in mind. There's policy issues and stakeholder issues and research issues and electronic issues and data and tools. And do you even need to solve this problem? Do you even need technology for this problem? Can you collect data on paper forms? It can be very overwhelming. So for your average new student learning health outcomes research, it would be really hard to know where to start. So I made this sort of campy image of seeing the forest for the trees, that really everything is important. You do kind of need to know a little bit of everything. Everybody tends to have their one domain of expertise. Mine, actually, I think I'm more of a jack of all trades, master of none, but if you have a little bit of technological understanding, if you understand the clinical workflow, if you have a basic understanding of the policies that might impact your research, if you know who the stakeholders are at the hospital system that you ultimately want to implement your solution, if it's scientifically feasible, having an idea of all of these things is important before you can implement your solution in practice. So my advice is to identify where your domain of expertise is, know what you don't know. I hear that a lot, and it's really true that health informatics in general is a very, very broad field. It is impossible to know everything about health informatics. So just knowing what you don't know is a good start, because then you can identify team members who have other domain experience to help you get started. So, and just a little pitch for Procore. I think it's really impressive how Procore has people with methodological, scientific experience and technical experience. You don't see that in a lot of university groups, so I think, you know, as far as outcomes research is concerned, it's a great place to start. And then I know I'm taking too much time, but just I came up with this theory of clinical research informatics that I wanted to share, particularly with Javed, that I've noticed in advising students and clinicians that there tend to be two very different approaches to solving problems in informatics. There's the scientific approach and the technological approach. The scientific approach you tend to see with academics, researchers, clinicians. They tend to have a very defined problem scope. They're taking a very scientific method approach to solving a problem. They have a specific clinical problem in mind that they want to solve, and they'll build out a solution over time, and that solution is going to be evidence-based. They're not always aware of what the features are, what are the new methods and modes that you could use to collect data, what tools are available. They might not be as familiar with the challenges, technological limitations and challenges, and they're a little bit more likely to use tried and true or traditional methods like faxing, paper, when there are tools out there that might make their life so much easier. And if you don't know what's possible, it means you won't know what approaches you can consider that might be useful. And on the flip side, and I saw this a lot when I was doing innovation advising for students, the other approach to clinical research informatics tends to be, let me build this thing, and then I'll figure out if it works and if it's feasible and if it is useful. There's just the approach of building the tool first, identifying, you know, with the market in mind first, and then getting validation and scientific evidence to support it later. So it's more of a business-minded direction. And it's the problem with this approach is that you often end up with solutions in search of problems. They're not always evidence-based, and there tends to be more difficulty in knowing what problem are you actually trying to solve. And this is where you have thousands of apps in the App Store that nobody ever uses, or they use for one day and give up on. So that is just, this is my theory of the universe, which is that ideally in health informatics, we would recognize that both approaches are necessary and give students tools for both of them. And if you don't know, if you're less comfortable with one approach, to have someone on your team with the other approach. So these are just recommendations, and I'll go through these kind of fast. Just having, if you're a scientific approach type of person, having a good understanding of the tools and technologies available, understanding that the tech world tends to progress a lot faster than the research world, and you really have to stay on top of it. Knowing that there is a lot of complexity in integrating different systems, especially the EHR. This isn't necessarily a technology issue, it's a governance issue. Recommending that you meet with domain experts who know technology and systems, and seeking out, this is the last one that I added just because of I used to work for the Gillings Innovation Labs, specifically seeking out sources of funding that are supportive of innovative approaches to research questions, rather than traditional funding sources which may be more focused on problem identification and solutions. And technological approach recommendations, these came from Matthias, but looking for devices that are most likely to have patient impact and focusing on those first, understanding that what you develop could be covered by health insurance if it improves patient care, And again, with governance, understanding the organizational change that's needed in order to use your technology. So with both, I recommend understanding governance. Governance is the biggest hurdle to implementation and innovation. So knowing who the stakeholders are at your institution and what are their strategic priorities, knowing what the barriers might be to implementation, knowing what needs to be done before your solution can be implemented, and knowing if there are technology barriers. These are all important as well. So this is just a screenshot of the deliverable that I have for the practicum. I've got a 30-something page guide being built that's it's targeted towards new researchers and students who are interested in doing health outcomes research. It's intended to be a basis for what do you do with data, how do you manage it, how do you collect it, what is possible. So this is sort of from the scientific viewpoint, scientific approach. So what's next? This is just my plan for the future. Since I do work for Procore already, I'll continue to work with them. The next step that I'm really excited about is helping to write some of the technical and end user documentation for our platform. And then also really excited to help build APIs that interface with consumer devices, maybe new consumer devices, maybe Amazon Alexa. Then finding new ways to integrate outcomes research into clinical workflows. That one is complicated and involves governance. And then one that is in the works is trying to develop predictive algorithms based on our trove of outcomes research data. I think that's it. So thank you to everybody here. Do you have any? I have reference slides there. This doesn't even capture. There are so many references on this. Does anyone have any questions?
You covered a lot of ground.
Yes, it's a very big topic. Two big topics squished together.
Yep.